Hello class, we begin our next unit on ancient Egypt. Let's take a look at the geography of Egypt. In the north you have the Mediterranean Sea, in the east is the Red Sea, and in the west is the Sahara Desert. Remember, there is only one S in desert. There are two in dessert because you always want to eat more. Most of Egypt is the driest desert land on earth, except for a narrow green strip called the Nile River. This is the Nile River. The Nile River flows upward. It flows northward and ends into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, the longest river in the world, the Nile, measures about 4,000 miles long. It ends in a delta. Delta is a triangular shaped deposit of sand and silt or fertile soil at the mouth of a river. The Nile Delta is very fertile. Unlike the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, the Nile is very predictable. Each spring, snow on the mountains in eastern Africa melts. When it melts, the Nile River floods about the same time each year. When it does flood, it leaves a very narrow green valley strip, about 13 miles of land, that's very attractive to animal and plant life. It's so attractive that the nomads, remember the nomads? They stopped through here about 12,000 years ago. When that flooding recedes, and recedes means to go down, it leaves a strip of black topsoil that's very rich in nutrients, and because it is, the people in Egypt are able to get 2 or 3 crops from it a year. Many civilizations relied on the Nile River, and it was considered the mighty river because it made it possible for people in Egypt to form the first nation in history. We will speak about that in a few minutes. Now, as you can see, there are cataracts, which are natural rapids that we'll discuss in a minute, that offer protection in the form of a geography, and the delta also offered a form of geography. Because this river flows upward, this is considered in the southern portion of Egypt, Upper Egypt, and the northern portion of Egypt is called Lower Egypt. Now, the topography and geography of Egypt can be separated sometimes, and is called red land and black land. Red land is barren desert land that protects Egypt on 2 sides. It separates Egypt from many neighboring countries and is mainly used and suitable for precious metals that they may need in their daily life. On the other hand, black land is that rich, fertile soil that we were talking about that's found along the banks of the Nile River and is specifically used for growing crops. How did the geography in ancient Egypt help the Egyptians? Well, there were several reasons. The most obvious reason is it provided water for drinking and growing crops. The cataracts that we mentioned earlier were in the southern part of Egypt, and they were very difficult to sail across, which kept out enemies. The deltas, on the other hand, were very marshy in the northern part of Egypt and kept out enemies. Now, as a result of the Nile and all the benefits that he had to offer, an agricultural revolution of sorts started in Egypt about 3200 BC. The people there began to use irrigation to water the fields, and as a result of that, they were attracted and were able to control a lot of plants and grow a lot of wildlife. Okay, so the wildlife they were able to grow when they watered the fields were fish, duck, and geese. Now, you don't really grow fish, you don't grow duck, you don't grow geese, but I guess because they were able to control the irrigation, they were able to use this as their food source. And in terms of plants, they were able to use that irrigation to grow wheat and barley. A man named Herodotus, who was a Greek historian, called the Nile Gift of the Nile. He named it Egypt, the Gift of the Nile, because he felt like Egyptian civilizations depended on the resources of this great river in order to sustain them. And as a result of that, they were able to form the nation's first community in history. Now, what is a nation? It's a group of people who share a common language, culture, and ethnic background. Because the flowing river, talking about the Nile still, is renewable, which means that water will never run out, they were able to take the civilization and turn it into a community of people, and that is called a nation. And again, the Nile River made it possible for people in ancient Egypt to form the first nation in history. Now, as I said in the beginning of the video, Egypt has been around a very, 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 very long time. Let's look at it on a timeline of sorts. Historians divide Egypt into three different parts. It began around 3150 BC, and it lasted until 343 BC. Now, this time period is divided into the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. This can help us understand just how long Egypt was around. Now, Menes, we'll talk about him more later, he's the one who united these kingdoms, and he did that in about 3100 BC. And King Tutamen, also known as King Tut, ruled in 1330 BC. If you do the math between the time that Menes united these kingdoms and when King Tut ruled, that's 1770 years. Let's round that to 2,000 years. Well, so what? What's the big deal about that? Well, let's look at it in terms of the United States of America. Of course, 1776 is when we came on board. And if you go from 1776 to July 4th, I believe, of 2014, that makes us about now 251 years old. That's still a baby compared to how long Egypt was around. And I just said all of that and wrote that down on a timeline so you can just see and understand that by earlier accounts, ancient Egypt has been around a very long time. What happened to Egypt? Well, the Persians conquered Egypt, Alexander the Great came along board, and then we had the Romans. We'll talk about that later.